For 200 years, a people living in the mountains of Tennessee told the world exactly where they came from. And for 200 years, almost nobody believed the real reason why. They said Portuguese sailors. They said Turkish soldiers abandoned by a lost colony. They said Mediterranean traders, shipwrecked centuries before America existed. Outsiders called the story colorful folklore. Historians dismissed it as backwoods myth. Then DNA testing finally reached them, and it didn't just correct the legend. It revealed exactly why an entire community had spent 2 centuries needing the world to believe something that wasn't quite true, to hide something that was. This is the story of a bloodline that had to disguise itself to survive, and the science that finally read through the disguise. High in the ridges of Hancock County, Tennessee, on a stretch of high, poor ground called Newman's Ridge, there lived, for at least 2 centuries, a group of families that didn't fit any box the world around them was offering. Outsiders called them Melungeons. Their skin was often darker than their white neighbors. Their features matched no single category anyone around them used. And in a place obsessed with racial classification, where which box you were placed in decided whether you could vote, testify in court, or own land freely, not fitting any box wasn't just confusing, it was dangerous. So the Melungeons did something that would define the next 200 years of who they said they were. Family after family, generation after generation, they insisted they were something else. Not black, not white, something older, something foreign, something safer to be. The story the Melungeons told about themselves wasn't vague. It was specific, dramatic, and almost cinematic. Some said they descended from Portuguese sailors, shipwrecked on the American coast generations before English colonists ever arrived. Others said Turkish soldiers, abandoned by Sir Walter Raleigh's failed Roanoke expedition, fleeing inland to intermarry with local tribes. Still others pointed to the Roma, wandering traders out of Europe, or even further back, to a lost tribe of ancient Israel. Every single version of the story shared one quiet detail. It placed Melungeon origins somewhere far away, exotic, ancient, anywhere except the one place that, in a segregated America, was the single most dangerous place a bloodline could come from. For nearly 200 years, nobody could prove or disprove any of it. The story survived precisely because nothing could touch it, until DNA could. In the early 2000s, a new field called genetic genealogy, DNA testing combined with old-fashioned family tree research, reached the Melungeons for the very first time. In 2012, researchers Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Crain published the first serious academic genetic study of the community in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, titled simply Melungeons, a multi-ethnic population. They weren't trying to prove or destroy any legend. They were doing something almost deceptively simple, tracing, family line by family line, exactly where the Y chromosome, passed only from father to son, and the mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, actually came from. It was careful, methodical, almost boring on paper. What it found was not boring at all. The results didn't point to Portugal. They didn't point to Turkey. They didn't point to the Roma or to any lost tribe of Israel. Across the core Melungeon family names, Gibson, Bunch, Collins, Goins, Mullins, the paternal lines traced overwhelmingly to sub-Saharan Africa. The maternal lines traced overwhelmingly to Northern and Central Europe. In plain terms, the founding generations of the Melungeon people were in large part the children of African men and European women. Unions formed in the colonial Chesapeake and Carolina backcountry at the exact historical moment when such unions were becoming illegal. That on its own was already a quiet earthquake, but it wasn't the whole story. Buried inside the same data was something smaller, stranger, and far harder to explain: threads of Native American ancestry, and in independent testing of certain maternal lines, genetic signatures that matched neither Europe, nor Africa, nor North America. Signatures pointing instead toward the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and even South Asia. A people who had insisted for 2 centuries that they came from somewhere exotic turned out to be more complicated than either the legend or the simple correction to the legend could fully explain. 3 explanations have competed to make sense of the fuller picture. Unlike a tidy mystery, not one of them has been fully eliminated. The first says the colonial frontier was never as clean as textbooks pretend. In 17th century Virginia and Carolina, before slavery hardened into a rigid racial system, free Africans, indentured Europeans, and native peoples lived, worked, and sometimes married in the same small settlements. The laws banning interracial marriage came later, meaning the founding unions of families like the Melungeons happened in a narrow historical window when such mixing was uncomfortable, but not yet illegal. As those laws tightened, these families didn't vanish. They moved into the mountains, onto land nobody else wanted, where the reach of the law was thinnest. This explains the African and European ancestry cleanly. It does not fully explain the Mediterranean and South Asian threads. The second theory points somewhere almost nobody expects. Not Europe, not Appalachia, but the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast, generations earlier. Spanish expeditions like Hernando de Soto's brought enslaved and free people of mixed indigenous, African, and Mediterranean ancestry through the Southeast decades before English colonists ever set foot here. Some researchers argue that Melungeon ancestry's more unusual signals may trace back to these earlier, largely unrecorded movements of people through Spanish Florida, generations before Newman's Ridge was ever settled. And the third theory is the one almost nobody wants to say out loud, because it means the legend wasn't purely invented. That the Melungeons' own oral tradition, Portuguese sailors, Mediterranean traders, foreign soldiers, might not be a complete fabrication built only to hide African ancestry, though it certainly served that purpose too. Some genetic genealogists argue the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern signals are too specific and appear too consistently across unrelated family lines to be pure coincidence. If even a handful of Mediterranean or Iberian individuals were absorbed into the founding population before it moved into the mountains, an isolated intermarrying community is exactly the kind of place where that signal wouldn't fade. It would concentrate. It would survive. None of these theories cancels out the others. The truth may be all 3 at once. A colonial frontier that was mixed from the start, a Caribbean detour nobody wrote down, and a handful of individuals whose origins actually match the legend, hidden inside a story built mainly to hide something else. Here's what makes the Melungeon case different from almost any other genetic mystery. This community didn't just tell a commercial story for fun. It needed the world to believe that story, or at least to doubt the alternative, to survive. In a legal system where being classified as black meant losing your land, your vote, and your children's future, claiming Portuguese or Turkish ancestry wasn't idle folklore. It was a defensive strategy, repeated so consistently across so many generations that it eventually became identity itself. The DNA didn't just correct the historical record, it revealed exactly why the record had been written that way in the first place. The exotic origin story wasn't a random invention. It was a rational, high-stakes response to a very real danger. And it worked well enough, for 200 years, to let this community survive on land nobody else wanted, under an identity nobody else fully believed. So who were the Melungeons really? Today, most people with documented Melungeon ancestry have made a choice their ancestors couldn't afford to make. They've stopped denying the African heritage survival once forced their families to hide, while still holding on to the unresolved threads, the Mediterranean signals, the questions science hasn't fully closed, that may or may not connect back to the legend their grandparents swore was true. What began as folklore, dismissed by academics for 2 centuries, turned out to contain both a truth someone was desperately trying to hide and a mystery nobody has fully solved. The Melungeons built an identity to survive a world that had no room for what they actually were. In the end, their blood turned out to be more complicated, more international, and more human than either the legend or the law that forced it into existence ever allowed them to be. Every population that insists it knows exactly what it is, exactly where it came from, exactly who belongs, is telling a story shaped as much by fear and survival as by fact. The genome doesn't care about the categories we build. It only remembers what actually happened. A legend can protect a family for 200 years. It takes a single drop of blood, read correctly, to finally tell you why they needed it. Subscribe to Blood and History. Next episode, we go looking for soldiers who allegedly never came home, in the DNA fight that still hasn't ended.